So in the past few videos, we've gone through creating an SAP HANA 1 instance, upgrading it to revision 70, and then installing the variant client tools that we need in order to connect to our SAP HANA 1 instance. In this video, what we're going to do is look at a gentle introduction into using SAP HANA Studio. We're going to do a few things. Firstly, we're going to create a connection to our server. Then we're going to create a sample schema. Then we're going to create some tables which we can access. And lastly, we're going to show you how to create a user which has only select rights on those tables. Again, just to give you a gentle introduction into those four different types of objects: connections, users, schemas, and tables. So this is what the SAP HANA Studio will look like when you've launched it the first time. What we're going to do is go, if we click on our double boxes here, this is what's called the a perspective. So there are in SAP HANA 1, in the Studio, there are different perspectives. Now, you can access your perspectives from this icon here. So there are different things. So one of them, for example, is the administration console, which is the main perspective, where you can monitor your servers. Another one is, for example, this SAP HANA Modeler, where you can build various views to be consumed by different BI tools. Lastly, another example would be the SAP HANA Development perspective, which we're going to look at much later in depth in this Live 2 project. We can stick with choosing our SAP HANA Administration Console. So quite simply, on the left-hand side is your list of will be a tree list of objects. This is where will do most of your work, and then here you have error logs and properties about your specific objects. So the first thing that we need to do is create a connection to our SAP HANA 1 server. So we can do this on the left-hand side by right-clicking and selecting Add System. So again, there's different ways you can do this. What I showed you before was actually using the IP address when we created the SAP HANA 1 ODBC DSN. But of course, what we can do as well is use a host.ini file. So I'll quickly recap how we do that. So if I'm going to exit the Studio, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the following folder, which is C. It's in the Windows folder. Within the Windows folder, we have a folder called System32. Then we have our drivers, and then we have etc, and we can go and open up our hosts. This just means that we can actually start forgetting the name of our IP address of our HANA server and just give it a specific name. So I'm going to open that up with Notepad. And all we actually need to do here is put the IP address of the Linux server, which is where our SAP HANA 1 instance is. So for me, it's 54.245.248.235. And then with a space, just put a name that I want to use. So I'm going to use from now onwards the word HANA to refer to that IP address of our SAP HANA 1 instance. So I'll save that by going to File, Save. And then what we'll do now is we'll go back into the SAP HANA Studio and we'll create a connection to that SAP HANA 1 server, which of course again is running on Linux. So now that we've edited our hosts.ini file, when we create a connection, again by going to right-clicking on the left-hand side and selecting Add System, instead of actually having to type in the IP address or the actual public DNS name of that actual SAP HANA 1 instance, we can just now type in the word HANA. Again, when you create an SAP HANA 1 instance in AWS, the default instance number is 00. You might see this instance number is different later on in the course because we're using also a different HANA server, but whether it's 00 or 01, you would just change it here, the connection here. So in this demo, we're going to use the instance number 00. If you want, you can give a description to your connection. So I'm going to call this main, and then I'm going to click on next. Next, we need to choose our authentication. Now, we're going to log in this first time with the system user, and the password I'm going to choose is the password that I created before in our SAP HANA 1 Management Console. Now if you want, you can store this centrally within secure storage on this Windows machine, which means you won't have to keep remembering to type in your SAP HANA 1 password. So you can choose to do that or not depending on the type of security you want and who can access this Windows machine. So when I've done that, I will click on Finish. Now we've already verified that the HANA 1 server's up because we saw that in the SAP HANA 1 Management Console. But this is also confirmation that we can see here quite simply. We have our 4 main folders. So when you create a connection in SAP HANA 1 Studio, you've normally got a backup option here where you can create backups. Catalogs is a list of each of your schemas or databases. When you create models, which we're going to be doing later on in the Live 2 project, you create them here. A model, for example, would be to aggregate or to create a view of your data specifically for one of your BI tools. You can do that in your content folder. Then below that, we've got our provisioning folder. So again, later on in the course, we're going to be loading data using Smart Data Access. I'll explain what that means when we come to that. But Smart Data Access is handled here within our provisioning folder. Lastly, of course, we create users within our security folder. So that's essentially, there's a lot more within those folders, but at a high level, that's what each of those folders is for. So what we're going to do firstly is we're going to create an extra schema. So if I drill into catalog, for example, this is a list of databases or schemas that we're given access to. Now, for example, if I go into my system schema, these are the objects which are contained within each of your databases. So you have obviously tables, triggers, views, sequences, your typical types of database objects. To see any tables, you would select the object tables, and if any objects exist, you would see a list of objects selected here. So for example, if I go down to my sysrepo folder and go to my tables, what we'll see here is we've got a whole load of table objects, and just to show you, the way you view the data is by right-clicking and going to Open Content. So here you can see we're connecting to a table, we're running a SQL statement on this table, and we're selecting the top 1,000 rows from the table, and it's just one of our system tables. So what we're going to do firstly is we're going to create our own objects. So to do this, what we can do is if we go back to the top level, I'm going to close this window here and close this here. What we can do is at the top level, if I select our system, our top level of our tree where the connection is, here you've got an icon which is the SQL console. So if I select SQL console, we can actually type SQL. Now don't worry too much, for example, if I was to change the view of these windows and you forget, because if you go back to your window, you can also always reset your perspective and it'll give you the default perspective, and just in case you mess it up. So if I go back to my top level, we're at the, within our catalogs. What we're going to do here is create a schema just by using some SQL. So the command to create your own schema here would be create schema and then the name of the object. So it's kind of the same way to create most of the objects. Create the objects that you want to create and give it a name. Now obviously I'm only going to go through what we need for the Live 2 project, but all this is fully documented within our SAP help documents. So again, if I launch a browser and I do a simple search in Google, and I search, for example, SAP HANA create schema. Of course, then here, which is publicly available, you've got all the options which are needed when you create a schema. Very, very, very straightforward. So we're going to create a schema called Live 2. So you create the, you put the syntax here in the SQL window, and then to execute, you can click here or click on F8. That will execute that statement. The confirmation whether the statement's been executed is displayed here on the bottom, so we can see that it has been successfully executed. Of course, if I try and create it again, it already exists, so we can't have a duplicate name. So all the error messages, any messages and confirmation messages are given to us at the bottom of the screen. Also indicated here, you have the error. So how do I know if my schema exists? Well, if I now refresh my catalog, we should have a schema, an empty schema called Live 2. So that's what we've got at the moment, an empty schema, and of course this one has no tables. So what we want to do is actually create some empty tables. So again, I'm going to go to the top level, I'm going to click on my SQL window, and there's different ways you can create tables. One of the ways which we won't cover, but it's kind of obvious, if I right click on my tables folder, I can create a new table and I can enter all the options here. Very easy to learn. But what we're going to do is use a script to create a table. Now, what we'll do is we're going to create 4 tables for the Live 2 project. So the first one we're going to create is a table called members. So this is a list of members of a group and which have various attributes about them, such as a name, first name, last name, email, an avatar, and a lat long to describe where they're based, for example. So here you have obviously the statement to create the table. Again, if you want to find out more information, go to do a search for create column table SAP HANA in Google and you'll get all the various options. The key highlights I want to highlight, of course, this is the data type on the right hand side, and this is, we're indicating the primary key of that table. Very straightforward. Now, if I create this table the way it is, it's going to create it in what's called the system user, because we haven't told the script what schema to use. There's different ways you can handle this, but the easiest way is simply to type at the top, set schema, and give the name of your schema. So for us, it's going to be Live 2. So that means any command executed after that statement will be in the Live 2 schema. So if I execute that, it will create the table. Again, to verify that the empty table is there, we're going to right click, go to refresh. And of course, here we see that members table. And if I right click and open the content, it's an empty table, straightforward. So we're also going to need 3 other tables. So I'm just going to copy the syntax and paste it in. Of course, all this syntax will be available in your zip folder. So we're also going to install, create connections, a table called connections, a table called tweets, and a table called time window. So quite simply, the connections table contains the IDs from the members table, and it shows you which people know which people. So for example, if you've got 2 users, Bob and Phil, then if those 2 people know each other, their ID, one column will have 1, 2, assuming that Bob is ID number 1 and Phil is ID number 2. The tweets table is going to be used, and this table, we're going to look at this table later on within the prediction section to try and predict future connections. This table called tweets is going to contain a list of tweets with a date and which member within our group actually made the tweet. It's a list of political tweets we got from Twitter. And lastly, this is just a time dimension called time window. So you can see we've got 3 extra tables that we're creating there. Obviously, we're going to go through these tables more in depth later on. So we can execute all those tables together because we've indicated that with the semicolon here. And again, if I refresh my list of tables, we've got access to those tables there. Now, there's various ways in which you can load the data into your tables. And of course, the Live 2 projects, we're going to show you how to use Smart Data Access to connect to various systems to load data. We're also later on going to look at using simple CSVs so you can just get up and running very quickly in case you don't have access to those additional systems such as Hadoop. We're going to cover that later on in the course, so it's fine that these tables at the moment are empty. There's a problem though, is that if we start using this user, which is called system, and we start giving this user out to people to use, then they have the administrator access to all our tables. So quite simply, they can go along to our connections tables if they want, run a delete statement and actually delete the table, as you can see here. So now we've only got those 3 tables. So this is obviously something that we don't want to do. So what we're going to lastly look at is creating a user which only has select access on these tables. And again, it's just a general introduction into how we create users. So because I've executed these two commands, and I did that by selecting the two commands, if these are the only two selected and I click on execute, then only these two commands will be selected. If I now right click on tables and go to refresh, then we'll see that we've got those 4 tables again. So what we've done there is we've created the tables using scripts. Now you don't have to create all the objects in SAP HANA Studio using scripts. There's obviously a UI which you can use. So of course we can create the users using scripts as well, but I'm going to show you how to actually manually create the user using the UI. So we can close this window. So we're going to create a user called Live2 who only has read-only access to these tables. We'll prove that because we'll try and delete one of the tables and we should get authorization denied. So to do this, of course, because this is a security, we go down from our catalog folder all the way to our security folder. So within users, I'm going to create myself a new user. And I'm going to call this just Live2. And then we need to give it a password. There are different authentication methods, and all these different authentication methods are handled in other videos within the SAP HANA Academy. So I'm going to give it a password, which is SHAL in capitals IVE lowercase 1. So I'll do that, I'll confirm that. And then what I'll do, just to get the user created, I'll click on execute. So again, there are certain rules when you create users. One of the rules is that, for example, I cannot create a user who has the same name as an existing schema. So I'm just going to create this as Live2 user. And again, click on execute. And again, those messages are displayed here in the top in red. So now that we've got that user, we should see that user here if I right click on my list of users. Now, this is the user here. Now, what we have here are other things such as the validity, so we can make this user last a certain amount of time. We can then assign specific rights on that user. So obviously for us, we're going to assign a right which gives them only select access to our schema called Live2. So if I add an object privilege, there are different types of privileges and we cover them later on and in different videos within the SAP HANA Academy. I'm going to do a search for live. We should find that schema. There we go. And I'm going to say that the rights for Live2 is select only. And it's not grantable to others. So you can see this is the way in which we can assign rights to users within SAP HANA. I'll then click on execute and that user's been modified. So now when I go back, we can see that we've got that user created here. So you can see that we can allocate rights based on on the UI, as I've done here. There's other different types of privileges which you can add as well, which we'll look at later on in the course. But also you can do this through scripts. So an example command is, well, I'll be forced to change the password of this user. So again, we can use the scripts as well as the UI. So here's a script which will enable us to disable the password lifetime, which means we don't have to change the password every 6 months or every 3 months. So you can actually create users with scripts or the UI. So a lot of the objects within the SAP HANA Studio you can create with a UI or you can simply create with scripts. Now, how can we test that user? Well, it's very straightforward. Remember, we gave select rights on that user, so we probably want to test that those rights work. So the simple way to test it is to create another connection as that user and then try and delete a table. So we can do this by right-clicking on our actual connection and select Add Additional User. Then here we just need to add in that second user, so it's Live2 user. Enter your password, which for me is SHA-Live1, and I'll click on Finish. So again, what we should see is that we've only got access to a few schemas. One of those is the Live2 schema. You also, when you create a user, you'll have your own schema, which is the same name as the user that you've created, which is Live2 user. But if I go to the Live2 schema, we should see that we've got those list of tables. But again, if I now try and delete that table as logged in as that Live2 user, we should get unauthorized access. So I'll try and delete the table. And here we can see that we've got insufficient privileges and we're not authorized to delete that table. So that's a basic introduction into creating users within the SAP HANA Studio. We're going to look at that a bit more in depth later on. We're going to be looking at roles and importing objects later on within the Live2 project. So lastly, one thing I'd like to mention is that within the SAP HANA Studio, you can also look at the servers. So if I'm a user, I'm going to go back and select the highest level of my main connection. Here we have two wrenches, or spanners we call them in the UK. We can open up our default administration. So this is very cool. So you can look at the servers and you can administer all the servers from your SAP HANA Studio. So you can look at any alerts, you can look at the size that has been used on your various servers. And lastly, of course, what you can do as well within the SAP HANA Studio by right-clicking, if you want to, you can also stop and restart your servers. So there's various other options, and all of these other options are covered in other videos within the SAP HANA Academy. So again, obviously through the course, we're going to be going more in depth into the various objects within the SAP HANA 1 system. But this video is to serve as an introduction into SAP HANA 1 if you haven't used SAP HANA 1 before. So just to recap what we've covered, what we covered in this video was creating connections to your SAP HANA 1 Linux server from your SAP HANA 1 Windows box. We created a connection, we created schemas, and lastly we looked at creating tables using scripts. Also you can create them with the UI. And then we finished off with creating a user who only had select rights on those specific tables. Lastly, we created that additional user, that additional connection so we could test that user. So now that we've been through that introduction, what we're going to look at next is we're going to look at connecting to our SAP HANA 1 instance, the Linux server itself. There's a few ways we're going to do that. We can do that, and we're going to discuss that all in the next video. Thanks for watching. You can see more videos and download code snippets from academy.saphana.com.